Shirley, did you want to record?
It is recording already. So
Oh, okay.
Rob's running.
Got it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started. So welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. I'm Dr. Shirley Drazy, and I'm the Director for Teaching and Learning at AES. And it's our pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Josephine Kim, who Joe and I, as she is known, Joe and I go back a few years now to when I was living in Korea, and I met her there. So Josephine has worked with schools, and she works with counselors and a number of other programs through Harvard University and connections that she has across the globe, really. So Josephine, I'm going to turn it over to you to
Great.
giving us a little background, and welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm a big fan of Dr. Drazy, so when she says do this, I'm there. So thank you for being here. My goodness, at these moments during the pandemic and all of the uncertainty and unpredictability, I don't know about you, but every day is a bit of a blur. You know, long-term goals have kind of disappeared, I think. It's more about survival and just getting through the day. And so if you haven't had a moment to just take the time to say to yourself, good job, you're hanging in there, you're doing it. You know, whether you're doing a good job really doesn't matter right now, you're just doing it. And so if that's you, congratulations, we're all in the boat together. And so thanks again for being here, especially at such a late time. I know I was just telling some of you that it's 7:30 feels like bedtime these days after the long days. So welcome. So as you see my slide, I'd love for you to think about how this might remind us of our kids. I know this structure here looks very interesting. Any ideas or thoughts about how in the world this might be a symbol of children? It could be an adolescent, it could be even a college student, a young child. What do you think? Yeah, so when I looked at this, I know people are usually afraid to unmute themselves, and I won't force you. I see it in your expressions though. So for me, when I saw this, it definitely reminds me of a child. So life is hard, wouldn't you agree? Life is unpredictable, things happen, we can't control what happens. And it's this child kind of balancing life, and eventually, whether we like it or not, they are going to fall, right? And we often see our children falling and having to navigate and manage the trials, if you will, of life. And so how does this relate to parenting and self-esteem and setting our children up for success? If you look at this, they are going to fall. That's pretty inevitable because life is tough. It is a journey. It's full of life lessons, and those lessons are usually learned when our kids do fail and they do come across challenges. But how they fall, we may not be able to control. When they fall, how often they fall, those are all out of our control. But one thing we can kind of help them with is when they do fall, what happens to them? Do they crack? Are they so fragile that once they fall and it's a tiny bump, they're so fragile that when they fall, they really can't pull themselves back up because they've literally cracked like an egg because it's so fragile? Or are they hard as a rock and perhaps they fall, but maybe more so the damage is to other people around them and they're constantly hurting other people? Or are they kind of like a rubber ball? They're malleable, they're flexible, they're bouncy. And so even though they're falling and we can't help that part, when they do fall, they actually can still maintain who they are and they don't crack all over the floor. They're able to bounce back, right? And in essence, that's the role that parenting can have. In fact, I want to go ahead. So again, keep that picture in mind because it's such a nice metaphor, if you will, of parenting. And you have to laugh at Tom Hanks here and the movie if you saw that, Forrest Gump. I don't know if people have seen that, but there's this profound right, comment that he makes where he says, Mama always said, I wish I could kind of sound like him, but I don't. Mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. And isn't that so true? Especially now, 2020 is literally a box of chocolates, except at least you know when it's chocolates, it'll probably taste good, maybe different, you know, and looks different. And you don't know what's inside, but at least maybe it'll taste good. For us right now, we don't quite know what it looks like, what it tastes like, what's inside. All of those things are up in the air. And so, in essence, what we need to do is if life is so unpredictable, right, we have to ask ourselves, you know, how come some students actually do okay? And how come some students really fall and they're not able to get up, right? What is the difference there? Just like that image that I showed you before, right? Inevitably, everyone's struggling right now in some aspect, but how come some of them actually do okay throughout it? And some of them are really struggling and not doing so well. A big part of that has to do with our parenting. And the more unpredictable life is, right, the more predictable we have to be in our parenting. In fact, when you think about who is it that fares well through pandemics and all of these uncertainties, it's the people who definitely have a strong base of things that are still predictable in their lives, right? So if they know they have the support, if they know that they can go to a caring adult and not be judged, for example, if they know that there are certain structures in their life that are immovable, right? Whether that's the perceived love of their parents or whatever that might be, they actually do a lot better than the kids whose lives, maybe those factors are also unpredictable. And what's interesting about research when it comes to what our kids are born with, right, in terms of internally genetics, and then their environment, it shows over and over again that they're pretty equal. And yet, if I were to pick one, and if researchers and psychologists and other folks had to pick which one has the greater force, it's definitely the environment that our kids are in. And parenting styles actually determines much of that environment in which a child is raised. In fact, you know, some of you may know, but this Baumrine's parenting styles has been in session for a long time. In fact, it's been decades since it came out. And even now, as I was preparing, you know, for all this week for this session, I found myself thinking, okay, I know in my head what I should do, right? I've actually written books on parenting. I definitely have given a lot of thought to this. And yet sometimes what comes out of my mouth is not what I know here, right? We have these great desires, and yet when time is running out and we're exhausted from just the nature of our lives these days, things actually don't go the way we plan sometimes. And so I wanted to do a quick review and talk about these parenting styles that are so significant and also make a huge impact on our children. One of the styles I want to talk about is this authoritarian parenting. So for a lot of us who are coming from the Asian context, I would venture to say that we were raised with this type of parenting. And what's so interesting too is that even about 15, 20 years ago, if you did research, especially for Asian students, and said, what type of parenting actually makes you feel loved the most by your parents? It was quite shocking to actually see that students thought when a parent was authoritarian, when they were a little bit strict and controlling, not at all nurturing, right? They were stern in their discipline, they were kind of immovable in their rules and regulations. Students actually said about 15, 20 years ago that they felt love from that type of parenting. Now, if you ask them, I'm afraid they'll say, that's not love. I don't feel love or support from that, right? So here, what's great about this parenting, and there are some positives, the notion of having high expectations, right? And I'd like to believe that when there are high expectations, that underneath the high expectations, there's a trust that we believe our kids can do it, right? And yet, because the warmth and the support is low, the high expectations actually just comes towards the kid as pressure, right? And what we find with these children who are raised in homes where parents are extremely strict, where they're very rigid in their rules, that it's lacking conversation because a rule is a rule and there's no discussion around it, right? What we find is that children tend to be less independent. Also, they become very rigid, right? And we find that they have insecure self-esteem, that they're not able to perhaps problem solve things on their own because they're so used to having external forces and expectations put on them. Ironically, oftentimes we feel this type of parenting will get you the best outcomes, especially when it comes to academics, right? But what we find is the opposite, that there's poor academic achievement as well as poor social skills. And in fact, we see more and more behavioral issues coming about from this parenting. What about this one? Oftentimes we say, you know what? We're going to raise the self-esteem of our kids, and that means I'm going to lavish them with lots of praise, and I'm going to support them, and I will be their biggest fan. And that sounds really great, doesn't it? And yet we see parents kind of taking it to the other extreme of the pendulum, where everything is okay. So all of a sudden the rules, you know what? I don't need to make them because you are the center, right? And I want you to be happy, and your happiness is my best desire. What's so confusing about kids and adolescents is that they think, right? We think, people think that they would be happy if they didn't have rules and regulations. And yet at the core of what makes them healthy is boundaries and healthy limits, right? Healthy expectations. And so it's ironic because you would think it would make them very happy, and yet in the long run, it doesn't. So parents are extremely warm and supportive in this parenting style, and yet the expectations are very low. So in the other one, expectations were extremely high, but the warmth and care was really low. Here it's the opposite. We really care, the warmth is there, you're always maybe lovey-dovey and caring and hugging, and this is wonderful. And yet when it's not accompanied by that high expectation, kids kind of do their own thing, right? In fact, children take decisions instead of following rules. There's no discussion again because anything my child says goes. I see this type of parenting when, for example, a parent might come to the school and say, I heard yesterday talking to the teacher that you said this to my child. Is this true? Right? Because the child is so important that they kind of forget about everything else. I've also seen this where parents will say, oh, you went to school today, good job. And the child is like 14, you know, everybody goes to school. That's something everyone should do. You made your bed today, and the child is 16, right? So this very permissive, almost overbearing, just lots of care again, without expectations. And what's ironic again about this is that children end up with poor self-control. Because if everything goes, then you would think that they would also be very beefy when it comes to their self-esteem. But what we find is that they end up being very fragile. Imagine the more we give frivolous praise. Praise is a great thing, but it also takes an art, right? So when we praise, for example, outcomes and end products and say, wow, that's great. For example, I remember working with a very young child, a kindergartner, and she was drawing a tree. And the father wanted to give her good self-esteem. So what did he do? He says, wow, that is the best tree I have ever seen, right? And so this young child thinks, wow, I draw the best trees in the world. So she goes to kindergarten the next day and they're taking out their trees and she sees her friend's tree, which is actually so much better, and says, why did my dad lie to me? Right? In fact, when we give that type of praise, especially about the outcome or the end product, wow, another 100, great job, you're the best daughter, right? Whoa, first place again, amazing. Every time we do that, we have to realize that we're creating a very false bubble, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the thing about bubbles is they're very fragile and they can pop at any moment. The moment they actually don't get first place, the moment they don't get 100, you can imagine what happens, right? That self-esteem, because it actually wasn't a strong, solid self-esteem. It's going to be popped, and they will be so distraught, and they will say, how come, right? My parents, right, said all these great things to me, and now I'm realizing that actually wasn't the case. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone thought our child, right, your child was the greatest on earth. I hate to say it, parents, though. They are one of 20 in a classroom, right? They're one of hundreds in a school, and every child is that important. And so it's very difficult when we treat them in that manner in the home, because they begin to say, how come other people aren't treating me this way? What's wrong with you that you don't recognize my worth? Okay. As adults, children develop egocentric behavior. In fact, what we find with kids who do a lot of bullying to other people, they have low self-esteem. Treat you, right, in this grandiose manner that they were treated in the home, and that's just not reality. So the next parenting is uninvolved, or what we would call negligent, neglectful parenting style. And I hate to admit it, but wow, there are so many demands on us and so many things on our plate. Sometimes you're like, yes, 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 go play the video game. I just need a break, right? And so I'm not talking about the occasional moments when we need a break. I'm talking about, yes, there's a warm body next to me, but I don't really care, right? I'm still very much involved in my own life and who I am. And so even though there's this child, maybe the concern isn't quite there. The warmth and the support isn't there that we talked about, and the high expectations certainly aren't there. Uninvolved parenting style, neglectful parents who show neither strictness nor the warmth. It's almost like being very passive, right? No specific discipline strategy, definitely not much communication and discussion. As you know, children require a lot of narration, right? We constantly have to narrate what's going on for them. And that's pretty important, not only for their verbal and language development, but for their psyches, right? To know that they have somebody who's narrating the process of life, and that's super important. And yet, if they're missing that, then they become impulsive and have a real hard time managing their emotions. I can't tell you how many youth we have today who feel something and they're not able to regulate their own emotions. And therefore, they're lashing out or using physical violence or something else to try to get rid of that, right? We also see a lot of mental health issues in children who are neglected. And research will actually show that there's a change in brain chemistry, that brains actually respond to this neglect, and it changes structures. And so we can't take a child like that and say, why aren't you studying? Try this more. If you did, study a little bit more, you can do better. Well, their brain structures have changed so much. We also see that in children who experience a lot of toxic stress. Right now, we have great amount of stress in all of our lives. The toxic stress is when there's this great fear and the anxiety just won't go away. We see this, people use the example of if you were in a forest and you run into a bear, all of a sudden your heart's going to start pumping, right? Your pupils will enlargen because you're on a high alert because you're trying to survive that situation. Well, imagine if you come home, right? Or if you're at home trying to do remote work and you're having to be in that state because there's something that you fear. We call that toxic stress. And we also know that that's detrimental to the self-esteem of our children. So then I think you know where I'm going with this. Authoritative parenting, so difficult, not as easy as it sounds. It sounds lovely on paper, and it is a challenge. And if it's not patternized in the ways that we actually communicate with our kids, it's difficult to implement. But this is talking about responsive parents who are both strict. So they have regulations, they set expectations, but they're also warm and supportive. And so, yes, today, hopefully by now, each morning you're having some sort of a family meeting where you're sitting down together. Maybe that's at breakfast where it's a little bit hectic. But still, at some point in the morning before the day starts, we need to sit down, especially if your children are a little bit younger and they're not able to manage their time very well yet. We have to sit down and make a list of, okay, here's what's happening with me. I'm a working mom. I knew this was happening for me at 10 a.m. this morning, Eastern Standard Time. And so we sat and we talked about expectations of what needed to happen, right? And where people were going to be and what they would be engaged in. And so setting strict regulations and expectations, very important. And also saying, okay, now during my webinar, if you need me, here's what you can do, right? If you have questions, this is what we can do. Write them down. And then once I'm done, we'll talk about it, right? So there's also that warmth and support. Trust me, I'm not always like that, but I'm trying, right? So rules and expectations are clearly stated and they're justified. They're not just, I feel like putting this rule on you today, so I'm going to do that. No, there's usually a good rationale and it's justified, right? So it's not that, well, you had a horrible day yesterday, so I'm setting all these rules for you today, but it's actually for both of our goods, right? And we've had an open discussion about it. So hopefully it makes sense. There's also, as I talked about, this narrating, appropriate and open communication. Hopefully children are able to come to you about issues that they're experiencing. The moment, right, we invalidate their feelings is the moment they realize, okay, I see that mom is not able to handle this type of thing, right? And so what we bring into our conversations essentially gives permission for our kids and lets them know, actually, those are things that you could talk about with me. And there are lots of times, especially working with youth, where they will say some incredibly, amazingly shocking things. And sometimes that is their very intention, to shock you, right? But even then, to try to, keep our calm and even keel, and say, certain times I don't understand exactly what you're saying. I want to understand. So let's sit down and talk, right? This type of parenting. We find that these kids who were raised with this type of parenting style were happy and independent children. I use that example of the research that existed 15 years ago, where a lot of students of Asian descent were saying the authoritarian parenting actually helped them feel love. Well, now the generations have shifted and they're saying this type of parenting, the authoritative parenting, where there is some flexibility, the expectations are high, and yet there's the warmth and support, that actually makes me feel loved and supported. We also see that this helps kids develop really good social skills. Why? Because you're actually teaching them how to go back and forth in conversation, right? This is how social skills are learned and taught. You're also explaining to them, I don't know about you, but I talk a lot about my feelings. Wow, when this happens, this is how I feel, right? So instead of acting it out, I'm actually talking about it. And again, that's teaching a social skill. And also we see, the thing that we're really interested in, which is academic success. We see them doing well in school and we see them grow up to be contributing adults. I was speaking with a friend yesterday and she said, I admire any parent who can raise a child who can contribute to this society because it is not an easy feat. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it is not something to be taken for granted, and it takes intentional parenting. So I wanted to see, I just have a quick few real life scenarios of how this parenting, right, comes out in our everyday lives. And so what time is your teen's curfew on the weekends? How would you respond? Right? And I'll give you a moment to read that. So when it comes to curfews, as long as she doesn't wake me up, she can come home whenever she wants to, right? So begin thinking about what kind of parenting that might be. B is 10 p.m. sharp. I don't tolerate any delays. There are no acceptable excuses in my book, right? Or C, we usually decide the curfew together depending on what's happening that weekend, right? Maybe the school is having an event and it's going till 10:30, right? Or D, I don't set a curfew. No matter when he returns home, I will always stay awake and wait for him, right? What do you think? Maybe you can utilize our chat. You're welcome to use the chat to share which which actually finds affinity with you. But A, as long as she doesn't wake me up, she can come home whenever she wants. This is very neglectful, right? And yeah, we actually should care when they come home, right? B, 10 p.m. sharp. This is very rigid parenting. And there are times we need to say, nope, I can't negotiate this with you, right? But when you say things like, there are absolutely no acceptable reasons, then that becomes really tricky because there are sometimes a good rationale for being a little bit late. C is really the ideal, and I see roses around the letter C, right? You usually decide things together. Again, there's that idea, notion of conversing and discussions and negotiating and going back and forth. Um, and again, that's teaching social skills, right? And also being flexible enough. This isn't to say that we're always going to give in, right? But we're able to actually negotiate and be flexible and also problem solve, but do it together. And then of course, D, I don't set a curfew. No matter when he comes, I am always on call for my child. No, 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 you won't last too long with this, right? No, we do need some boundaries. Great. What about this one? How much allowance do you give your child? How would you respond? A, it's always the same amount. The amount cannot be changed no matter what, right? What about B? The amount could change if my child can communicate a very good reason and a sensible rationale. Okay, already you're seeing a little bit of the flexibility, right? Not like, okay, great, 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 I'll do it, but it's more, okay, tell me why, right? What about C? Oh, I give her whatever amount she wants. Okay. Yeah, good luck when she's about 17 and asking for, a Mercedes Benz. All right. And D, what allowance? I already feed him and put a roof over his head. What more does he need? Right? So again, that's a little bit of the neglectful and negligent parenting. But what about A? Again, that rigidity. I don't know if you've worked with people or been in a task group with people who are very rigid. We know that when things are very rigid with someone, it's difficult to work with them. In fact, they're really difficult to be around, period, right? What about C? I give her whatever amount she wants. Again, too permissive, lack of expectations, right? And when that happens, it's overindulgent and we're actually not doing our kids any favors. Okay, I have one more scenario for you. Your child wants to quit violin lessons. How do you respond? Can anybody relate to this one? It's probably one of the, right, parenting 101 conflicts that we have. How would you respond? A, we discuss the pros and cons and talk through the decision. We revisit the topic after we've had some time to think about it some more. So there's this idea that, you know what, when those conflicts arise, that you don't actually have to come up with a solution right away. There's this idea that actually conversing with our children, it should be an ongoing process, right? That you are not going to win a battle with one conversation. And then what about B? What piano lessons? Why would you throw away money like that? Again, a little bit neglectful. C, if my child doesn't enjoy it, of course she should quit right away. Why would I make my child do something they absolutely don't want to do? Okay, I see some, reasoning behind that. But if that decision is being made and you're letting the child decide, especially without any sort of discussion or negotiating, then you can imagine, again, it's setting them up for a life where they expect everyone to treat them this way, right? And once they go to work and they realize, actually, the boss doesn't like your ideas, right? And isn't going to allow this or that, then you can imagine how they would be very fragile. And like that ball might actually crack, right? And D, there is no need for a discussion here. He will continue the lesson, period. End of conversation. Again, I'm the one in authority here. I'm the adult. There's actually a word called adultism, right? Where it's actually an oppressive type of thing where I'm the adult and therefore I'm right. I know more than you and therefore you will do what I say, right? And authoritarian parenting has a little bit of that. I don't know about you, but in my head, I know exactly which one would be the best way. But sometimes I'm afraid that D comes out, right? And if that's you, please know that's very normal. And we see it often. And I think this chart is very helpful in, again, kind of summarizing the parenting styles. You see here the permissive, while it's high in love and warmth, it's very low in the limits and boundaries. Or the authoritarian at the bottom in the purple, the expectations and limits and boundaries are very high, which is great, but the love and warmth accompanying that is very low. Neglectful, unfortunately, is low in both the expectations and the love and warmth. authoritative, the one we're kind of idealizing here, but on our best days, right? We have high expectations and we set high limits for our kids. We know that they can do it, and therefore we put, right, these expectations on them. And it's also accompanied by the support and the love and the warmth that they need. And so if they happen to falter, we're able to support them through it. Here, though, what's important for us to realize it's that it's perceived love. For a lot of us, we say we love our kids and we do so many things because we love them. And yet, if they don't perceive it as warmth and love, right, then we can't really say that's warmth and love. For example, I know many fathers, I do seminars with dads alone, and it's amazing when they talk about, but everything I do is because I love my kids. I go to work early in the morning, can't come home till late at night, and I'm working, and it's all because I love my kids. And I remember asking a child, your dad works really hard. He leaves home early in the morning. He's not able to come back home till really late at night. And he says he's doing all of this for you. What does that make you feel or think of when you see him working so hard? And guess what he said? He said, I guess he likes to work a lot. So nowhere in this child's feelings or sentiments about his dad did the warmth and the support, like, oh, wow, my dad is doing all these things for me. Nowhere could that be found. It was, I guess he likes to work a lot. Like, what's that got to do with me? Right? Again, the perceived love and warmth wasn't there, even though the father, the intentions were definitely there. So, of course, I've got to talk about how does culture influence parenting practices, right? And India being part of South Asian culture, there are definite cultural influences on our parenting, right? In fact, we know in a lot of Asian cultures, and I'll be generalizing here, but because, right, we believe in harmony and the idea that you are part of a greater whole, right? The emphasis on the self is not as great as it is in the West. In the West, everything becomes about, well, how do you feel about this? If you were the main character, what would you do? Right? If you were experiencing these things, what is your opinion? What is your thought about this? And we teach our kids this thing called, we want them to articulate, right? And we want them to have what we call critical thinking. We want them to think for themselves and to be able to express and articulate exactly what it is that they're saying and what they're thinking. And when they can do that, we actually praise them. Well, in different cultures, especially in the East, I would say that is not a value that's been, something that's really highly valued, I should say, because when somebody does that, that actually takes away from the experience of the whole group, right? We see this often with, Western kids or even my child. What do you want to eat? Oh, he definitely has an answer for what he wants to eat. If you ever watch, right, when I'm in Asia and I watch Asian adults try to decide what to eat, which restaurant to go to, it takes them like 30 minutes because they say, no, where do you want to go? No, I'm all right. Where would you like to go? Right? And they do this. And it's because the sense of self is not as grandiose or big, or the emphasis hasn't been there as much as it has been in the West. But what's important about this is that now the world has become very globalized, and especially at AES, it's a Western American school. And so even if our kids are of Asian descent, they're actually coming up against these two cultural differences, right? And one thing I visually want to show you is it's amazing and great if all you see and all you hang out with are people just like you. And yet now, perhaps within the Western context in an international school, we're actually seeing this. Now, all of a sudden, they have to contend with people who are raised differently and socialized differently when it comes to the concept of self, right? And now we see, wait a minute, how come sometimes I struggle to speak up in class, for example, right? So these cultural influences definitely play a factor. Even for me, I'm a Korean American, but I would say I am really almost perfectly half Korean and perfectly half American. And when my child articulates his opinions and he's very verbose and he's very articulate, My American side praises him. Yes, I can leave him anywhere in the world and he will survive. And my Korean side dies a little because I keep thinking, oh no, he's too expressive. Oh no, no, too opinionated. Oh no, 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 no. Right? So I always have this inner struggle even within myself. But for us, it's really important to, and again, it's so easy, I think, when we look at cultural differences to say one is better than the next. But really the idea is we just need to see the difference, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, such a difference here. Same thing with this one. When it comes to the concept of the individual, the me versus the we described it a little bit, but the emphasis on the me in the West and really the emphasis on the we in the East. If you think about, wow, why are there so many cultural conflicts? Well, actually, because the East and the West are polar opposites, not only geographically, but in so many cultural aspects, right? In fact, I want to show you this really interesting study. This guy by the name of Nisbet looked at Easterners and Westerners and just the difference in cultural values. In fact, he showed them a video of fish swimming around in an aquarium. And afterwards, he asked the Westerners, hey, what do you remember from that video? And the Westerners, without fail, picked out, what do you think? The big fish. Why? Because that is the main character, right? It is an individual fish swimming around, and that's what they remembered, right? Because it's all about kind of the individual. Well, when Nisbet asked the Asian folks, what do you remember from the video? They pointed out the seaweed, they pointed out the snail, they pointed out the frog, and you wonder, what? Wow, such a difference here. How is this possible? Well, it's possible because they believe everything is connected and is part of the whole. And in fact, that large fish wouldn't be able to do what it's doing without, right, the collaboration and this environment that everything in that aquarium has created. So again, such a different way of viewing life and also viewing our children. So in the West, we might say, whoa, right? My child is the big fish, the main character, right? And in the East, they might say, actually, no, you're part of the larger picture, right? But again, you can imagine how this might cause some conflicts, right? And finally, it's the last one I'll talk to you about, cultural differences. But in the West, when we think of power, the distance is very small between the person in position of power and others who are not in position of power, right? And so, for example, if I run into the dean of my school, hi, Bridget, how are you? And we could have a great conversation. The power distance is very small. But in the East, usually the power distance is very great, which means the notion of authority and hierarchy is very valued. And that means, just like in the red here, it feels, right, much bigger. Whoever's in position of power feels much more, I guess, distanced, right, far from me. And so if you're coming into parenting with the values, right, of authority and hierarchy mattering a lot, and the power distance should be big, and that's how you feel, right, the relationship should be with our kids, then you can imagine as they're being westernized in a Western school, coming home and being very opinionated and sharing their ideas and being very expressive about it, how that could actually feel threatening to a parent who's coming from the red here, right? You can also imagine, though, in the West, that there's also a little bit of a danger of becoming too friend-like with our kids, right? In fact, I can tell you that parents and kids, unless you're like 60 and the parent's like 80, I think it's possible then, but really we don't need to try to be our kids' best friends, right? We hope they would have some peers who can take that role, not us, right? And we certainly shouldn't approach it that way if we need their companion, right? It's coming from a need that we have within ourselves. And so all of that to say, and I see that we had some artists drawing on my screen. I love it. Thank you. And of course, it's going to happen. But I wanted to share this really interesting research with you. When kids are stressed, some things they don't want to hear from their parents. Okay? And this was done in Asia, and very interesting. 35, almost 36% of them said they don't want to hear this. what could you even possibly be stressed about? Right? Because from a parent perspective, we've got big things like life issues that are stressful. And so we can't imagine a 12-year-old being that stressed. But this is one of the last things they want to hear from parents. Another one, almost 24% of them said, what you're going through is nothing. In fact, when I was your age, and then we begin talking about this is what I had to go through, and this is what I had to do, and you've got luxury and you don't have a want for anything, right? And that could be true. Perhaps, you know, what you see about your kids is nothing compared to maybe what you personally had to endure. It's just that in that moment, it's not what they want to hear. Another one, almost 23%. Everyone is stressed. It's not just you. And so when a child says, gosh, I'm really stressed about this, it's not just you, you know, you're not the only person on earth, you know, right? Again, you see the thread of invalidating our kids, right? Another one, you're too young to be stressed. You don't even know what stress is. Again, dismissing what they're experiencing and invalidating. 7%, it's because your mentality is weak. You know, I've worked with students who mustered up the courage to tell their parents, you know, I'm really depressed and I can't find the motivation to do my work. And the parent, I think it was coming from a place of, I don't know what to say in these moments. But what they said was, I think you're just lazy and you don't work hard enough. If you would just try a little bit, you can do it, right? And so even though they meant that as an encouragement, in that moment, what the child needed was validation, normalization, making something feel very normal, right? Oh, you know, I have moments when I feel that way too, right? Can you tell me what makes you feel that way right now? Right? And maybe you might start out with some of your own vulnerabilities. One thing I realize with parents and parenting is that sometimes we feel that we have to be perfect and we have to present ourselves as a strong tower for our kids. But what's really, really beneficial for our kids is to actually see our very transparent vulnerability, to be able to say, gosh, you know what, I really need 10 minutes to just stare at a blank wall. Can you come back to me in 10 minutes? Right? I'm really struggling with this thing right now. This happened today, and this is how I'm feeling right now. Do you ever have those times? Again, opening up that conversation, helpful for our kids, definitely for their self-esteem. So as my last slide, I have this picture. Parents are definitely mirrors for our kids, for their kids. And what I mean by that is, even if a child, you know, says internally, I'm a great person, I deserve happiness, I am well liked, I deserve to be loved, right? Even though they may feel that way, what's being reflected back to them is what kids know, right? And so if we, being the mirror to them, keep reflecting back to them, actually, you're not enough. You never do enough. You need to do this a little bit more. If only you would do this, you might be an okay child, right? If that's what we keep reflecting back to them, then again, what kids know about themselves is what's reflected back to them persistently and routinely. And that becomes internalized. What that means is it becomes a part of their normalcy, that they no longer need you to be the mirror to tell them that. They now think it and they now know that about themselves. But what's also interesting is that children are mirrors for the parents. And what I mean by that is, you know, there are moments when your child is extremely grouchy. At those moments, we have to ask ourselves, have I been grouchy lately? Because they are our mirrors and they will reflect right back to us what we show them, right? If they're angry a lot, right? I see this a little bit in my child these days. If they're angry and they're flustered and they're frustrated and they are lacking patience, I really do ask myself, wait a minute, have I been like that lately? And oftentimes the answer is yes. It's because what I was showing was the mirror. I was mirroring back, right? Reflecting back this message. And now he's reflecting it back to me. And so on that note, I will close the presentation part, but thank you. All of you are such great listeners. Thank you so much. Oh, you're muted. Hold on one second. Yep.
Muted myself. How would you like to take questions, Joe?
However you think is great. Oh, I see the answers now. I wasn't able to see it when I was sharing the slides. Great.
So if you have a question that you'd like to say, go ahead and speak out. And if you would
Sure.
rather put a question into the chat, we can watch that too. Okay?
Sounds great. Oh, and I'm sorry, I just saw the note about the volume. Uh-oh, I'll raise it now. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear better.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask you, it's really interesting. I mean, I would definitely say I'm a very permissive parent. But I had a question about that, which is, isn't the home a place where a child should feel really special? Because when they're out in the world, there are all those things that you described so accurately, right? They are one of 20. They're not going to be, and the teacher or whoever they're with is going to look at them as an equal with every other child. And I fully agree with what you said, that you can't bluster in and demand why a child was spoken to a certain way. And I'm really learning to respect slightly firmer teachers. I'm doing that now. And I really, as my child grows in confidence, it's nice to have strong figures around. But I feel that at home, my natural instinct is to give all of that extra love and validation that's a bit effusive. And but isn't that the place where the kid should feel totally like a king or queen?
I love that. I love the intentions behind your question, and totally support, this idea that of course we want, because there are kids, right? So while they might be one of 20 in a classroom in our home, there are kids. And even if they're in the classroom, when we see them, there are kids. Um, I love that part. So I don't want you to misunderstand that piece and that intention. I think the part I was speaking to is that when we overdo it, right? So of course they should feel special. And of course they should know that when they come into the home, I describe it as a soft cushion, because
Yeah.
life outside can be so tough. When they
Mm-hmm.
enter our homes, hopefully it's a soft cushion where they know they can fall and they won't get hurt, because we have that cushion, the buffer, right, their falls. And how wonderful is that? We also know when a home isn't like that, they're going to go out and find another place where it is, right? And so if they don't have the acceptance and the warmth and that special feeling, I guess, if you will, in the home, we know that they will go elsewhere and find that for themselves. And usually it's not in the best places. And so all of that, definitely right on. And I agree with you. The piece that I see often, though, is when it's overly done, it's overindulgent, and we make big praises out of small things that actually they should be able to do, right?
Okay.
In essence, what we're doing there is we're keeping the bar low, right? You're 16 and you just finished a meal by yourself, right? And they're getting praised for that. For me, what that shows is that the parent is keeping the bar low, and actually there's a doubt that you have for your child that they're not able to do more and they're not capable of doing more, right? So
Okay.
that's one piece. And not to say that that's what you're doing, I have no idea, but using that as an example. The other piece is when the specialness, that feeling of specialness, is overindulgent, right? And we're trying to make up and accommodate, overcompensate perhaps for, let's say, a child who's getting bullied at school. So at home, we try to overdo it, right? And we overcompensate for the feelings of hurt by making them feel even more special at home. Of course, there should be an element of that, but let's think about what lesson, right, or what life skill does that teach our kids? First, are you going to be around forever? Probably not, right? None of us will be
No.
around forever, right? Unfortunately. So wouldn't it be great if you were going to be around forever and you could do that coddling for your child every time? But unfortunately, one of the key things we have to do as parents is to make sure that they can live without us, right? That they are independent from us, that they don't rely on us too much for their emotional regulation, right? Definitely, we definitely, you know, depending on developmental stages, need to do that. I'll give you maybe a concrete example. So my child is extremely active, has always been, right? So when he was around like 3 or 4, he's active. We're in a store one day and boom, he falls, right? So what do? I look away. I'm looking for my products on the shelves and I look away, pretend I didn't see it. Now, why do I do that? Because I don't like my child? Definitely not. But what I'm doing at that point, I wouldn't have done this when he's 1 or 2 and just starting to walk, right? Because at that stage, he needs coddling. He needs to be made assured, you know what, even though you fell once, you could do it again. It's all right, right? But now that he's gone through that little bit of a stage, what I'm teaching him is by me not looking and pretending I didn't see it. And of course, I'm keeping an eye on what's going on with him, right? Because moms, we have eyes in the back of our heads, right? What I saw him doing was such a life lesson for me. What I saw him doing, when he looked at me, he saw that I wasn't paying attention, right? Or at least he thought. So what did he do? He got up, dusted himself off, regulated his emotions, right? And figured out how he was going to respond, overcame the idea that he fell, and yes, maybe it hurt a little bit. And then he came to me and reported it. He said, Mommy, I just fell. Wow, did you? I'm sorry I missed that, but look at you. You did it yourself. You learned to get up by yourself. And not only that, he learned to take care of himself and regulate his emotions. And so it's difficult, but at those moments to really think about kind of the underlying life lessons we want to leave. So I don't know if that answers your question. Definitely, I'm supporting you and also putting a caveat, right? That a balance is definitely a key. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. Oh, I promise my responses won't be this long every time.
That's okay. There's a question in the chat. There's a couple of them here. If the child is so into gaming and smartphone, how can we motivate them for more academic activity?
Woo, yes. I mean, can we all raise our hands or not? Raise our hands and feet if that's you right now. Having to manage the tablets and all of these other things. For me, I'll just speak from a personal stance. One, I personally like video games a lot. In fact, if I had a choice of how I could unwind from the day, I would play video games. And so I've learned to actually use that as something that I can do with my child. And so part of the motivation is one, you know, I talked about having that morning meeting with our kids. I think that's very important. Even if they're 17 and almost out the door to college, I still think that meeting is very important, where you check in the morning to see how everyone's starting their day, right? To kind of see what side of the bed they woke up on, right? So again, their mood and that type of thing, because we know lots of things are happening in their bodies at that point. But really sitting down and having a check-in point. We do this in schools, and it's so important, and we see such a difference in classrooms where they actually do this, take 5 to 10 minutes and check in with each other, versus people who don't, and classrooms that don't. And so I would definitely recommend doing that as a start. And then for me, because my child is in 3rd grade, we actually come up with a whole schedule of the day every morning. And he actually has to earn time, right, to be on his tablet to play games. And that's worked out really well. So how do you earn times? Doing your academic work and playing instruments or whatever it is that you might have, right? He's also learning Korean because I want him to be fully bilingual. So all of those things help him to earn minutes toward any, you know, video games and etc. I also think just because they're older, we can't say, okay, now you have 30 minutes to play whatever you want. We need to know what they're doing, right? And so as long as they can actually report to us what they're doing, and we trust them enough to do what it is that they said they're going to do, then I think that puts us in a nice pattern. I also am one to tell you that technology is a big part of their lives. And instead of fighting it, because that's going to make life really stressful for us, we need to find creative ways to utilize it. And I would say, let's do as much as possible, utilize it together. So like I said, I do play video games with my son. right? And quite enjoy it. And so why not do that? Because as I'm playing video games, it's not just the content or the tool, right? That's important. I'm actually having conversations. I'm actually spending quality time. And for me, that's pretty important. And if video games will get you to do that, why not? I'm not talking about 5-6 hours a day, right? But why not maybe an hour, maybe 2 if they're a little bit older. Not only that, I think if we can use technology as part of their academics, right? And so I don't know if they're older, if you just have them in a room doing their work, but sometimes maybe you can sit next to them and see how that's going, right? I see a vast difference between having my child in some place in the house where he's doing his work remotely, right, online with the teacher, versus me sitting there and actually taking in the stuff together, because then it gives us more things to talk about. And then academics, it's so easy to say, go study, go study, go study. But more than that, it's important for us to think about the values. What is it that you really want for your child? We know, according to research, that with an added degree, that life expectancy gets longer, life quality actually increases. So, I mean, these are things we want them to have. We also want them to be happy, right? And so the values underneath, right, why it is that academics are important and how it does set them up for different opportunities in life. Often it's this conversation that I find is missing, right? Missing from the go do this, you have to do that, and you need to sit and do this, right? And I think often the kids, especially adolescents, will say, if you can connect what I'm learning in the classroom to real life, then I find more meaning in that. And so if the teacher, because there's so much on their plates, are not able to do that, then why not do that at home, right? Hopefully that helps.
Another question, Joe. What happens
Yes.
if both parents have different styles of parenting?
Ooh, yes. For one, you have to show a united front, right? No matter what, in front of the kids, you have to show a united front. Even if you're bubbling up and something's about to come out, in front of the kids, as much as you can, show a united front. And definitely have some meetings. And the worst times to talk about these things to each other is when feelings are high and people are upset about certain things. I can't believe you said that in front of him. You know I hate that, da, 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 da. Probably not the best time to have that conversation. But you know, when things are going well, that's the best time to have these difficult conversations. But you know, you do need to sit down and say, okay, what are the negotiables? What is something you absolutely cannot give, right? And both of you will have that, right? But what are some things where we can meet halfway? But if you don't have that conversation beforehand, whoo, kids know. Kids can tell, right? And they definitely are master manipulators of triangulation. What I mean by that is they are able to create a triangle between you and your partner and themselves, right? And so very important, again, as much as you can, show a united front, but behind the scenes, definitely have multiple conversations. And don't try, as we mentioned earlier, don't try to have one conversation and feel like that's gonna do it. It probably has to be a daily thing, maybe a 10-minute check-in, right, every day. Yeah.
Okay, Joe, there are 2 other questions. I'm going to take them in reverse order here. Are there any must-reads on your list or other resources as quick tips for parents to strengthen the self-esteem of their children in a healthy manner?
Yes, and I actually have some sitting on my shelf. So if it's okay, I would love to send them to Dr. Daisy afterwards, and then maybe she can get those out to you. Yes.
Okay, or you can send me a list at some point too, Joe.
Yes, right. That's what I mean, yep.
That's easier. And then this person said, thank you. I will recommend to my husband next week also. What's a good way to hook his interest, even though I've already attended? In your words, please.
Yes. My hook. So when I do the seminars with fathers, and it's kind of fathers only, I say to them, you know, this is such a special moment and such a special space, not because you're doing everything wrong, but because you probably never realize how important you are in your child's life, right? And so try to, you see kind of what I'm doing here, right? I am a counselor, and so you see that coming. But rather than, you know what, I heard her speaking and these are all the things we're doing wrong, so we really need the session. That'll turn anybody off, right? But to say, gosh, I never realized that fathers were so important. I think it would be amazing if we can have the same content, have heard the same content, so that at least we have some sort of a working baseline, right? And I will mention, when it comes to self-esteem, you will be shocked that especially when kids are young, more than the mom's, right, influence, the father's influence actually has a greater impact. And not only that, when it comes to emotional regulation, anger management, all of those things, fathers actually have the larger impact when children are younger. And another thing, social skills too. When it comes to social skills, it's the fathers who have the largest influence. In fact, when we look at older adolescents who are struggling with depression, we find often this common thread that runs across them. And one of them is they lack social skills, right? And you wonder, well, how come they lack social skills? We see another common thread in their lives, and it's a lack of relationships with their fathers and a lack of communication with their fathers. And so, yeah, maybe you can emphasize some of those things. And again, kind of heighten and hype up this idea that, I mean, really, fathers are so important and they play a crucial role. And during the pandemic, we've all got to share the load, right?
So Joe, we are a couple minutes over, but we started a couple minutes late. So I'm going to wrap it up, but I want to say a couple things so everyone who is here understands. So next week's presentation is essentially the same presentation, but Joe's going to be delivering it in Korean language. And we have a very large Korean language or a Korean community at AES that we wanted to offer the same kind of information for them as well. And we are talking to Josephine about doing some other things. So maybe we're going to want to schedule one on fathering and some other things that you do, either with parents or the faculty too. So anyway, thank you so much. I see a plea for a father's session. So thank you so much, Josephine. It's always great to have you.
Thank you.
Have you. And we'll look for that book list and copies of the book.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming tonight.